he nodded his head and continued to extend his life for another 10 years. And it was because of that asking on behalf of the Sangha, because of his respect for the Sangha. And that, I thought, pointed back to the example in the Buddha's life where Venerable Ananda's mind was overcome by Mara and he forgot or didn't ask because he was confused and overcome with sadness that the Buddha was going to pass away, because there wasn't a cause. Then the Buddha could not extend his life out of desire. There has to be a cause. In this particular case, the Buddha, Ajahn Chah would never compare himself to the Buddha, but in this case, the cause had to come from the Sangha, not just his own wish. And it was those examples that set up the standards in our tradition for always respecting the Sangha. And the other aspect of Ajahn Chah's training, once you'd come to him and accepted his training, is that once you became his disciple, then he would teach you to have great patience and endurance. There was a word that's often used in Ajahn Chah's monastery, and it was called Torahman. And Torahman, when translated into English, means torture. And Ajahn Chah was an expert in Torahman. When you say that, it sounds unusual. How can a monk torture his disciples? It's interesting, you never got the feeling that there was any motivation coming from a self behind it, that it was for your own good, that somehow he saw a weakness there and he would make you rise up to the occasion. And I'll give you an example. I was sitting in the Abhosada hall. We were doing the chanting of the 227 rules of the monks, and then the Ajahn Chah gave a Dhamma talk. Normally he'd talk for an hour or two and we'd leave, but this day he talked for 7 hours. Now if I talked for 7 hours to you tonight, then you would get an understanding of the word Torahman. Okay. Especially if you cannot leave this hall. You're not allowed to get up from your seat. After 1 hour it's inspiring. After 2 hours it's getting boring. After 3 hours it's definitely getting on the level of Torahman. And it's very interesting, as he was giving this talk, it was very high Dhamma. And he would then sometimes, I remember after 5 hours, my knees were screaming. And I was looking for a way out, but he couldn't leave. And I remember him looking around, and he looked straight at me and he said, "Are you suffering?" And I thought that was obvious. And then he said, "You have to find a way out of suffering in the mind. Don't run away from the suffering." Because the Buddha's teaching of the First Noble Truth is to understand and know and comprehend and transcend suffering. And so it was by pointing you back, and when he pointed me back to the mind, then you could see that yes, he was actually giving you the opportunity, because if you were just to sit meditation alone in your heart, you normally don't sit for 7 hours straight. When the pain gets strong in the knees, you want to shift or change. But he was using the peer group pressure of the community of monks sitting there and the pressure of the teacher sitting there. He was sitting without moving through the 7 hours as well. I'm sure his knees ached as well. But he was pointing us and each and every person back. Dukkha needs to be comprehended, investigated and understood and transcended through that understanding, not through running away. And that was a great skill, but also I think his greatest skill was that he didn't lose many disciples as well. Because if it's coming from the wrong place, you cannot do that again. I cannot get my monks at my monastery to sit for 7 hours while I give a talk, because of the paramitas are not there. The Dhamma is not the same. It's just like when the Buddha would give a talk to the monks, he would talk sometimes all through the night on Dhamma, and the monks would be listening, inspired, because of the paramitas of the Buddha, the spiritual qualities, the power of his mind, the power of his Dhamma teachings, the clarity of them, the skill in the presentation, and what they were pointing to, his ability to understand and comprehend the audience and the Dhamma to teach that audience at that particular time. That is a great teacher who can do that. And not everyone can do that. The other quality of Ajahn Chah's in terms of his Dhamma teachings was his teaching of how to let go of suffering. So not just pointing out to endure and be patient through what is difficult and unpleasant, but also to how to let go of things and how to put things down. And one of the monks was telling me that he went with a walk through with Ajahn Chah, and as they were walking through the forest, there was a big branch laying on the path, and Ajahn Chah got him to pick one end of the branch up, and Ajahn Chah picked the other. And as they picked it up, it was very heavy. And Ajahn Chah said, "Is it heavy?" And he said, "Yes." And then they threw it off into the forest and then said, "Now is it heavy?" And he said, "No." And he said, "So too, if your mind lets go of everything, it will be light." So he would say that if you let go of your attachments a little, you obtain a little peace. If you let go of your attachments a lot, you experience a lot of peace. If you let go of your attachments completely, you experience complete peace. And I want to maybe give you an example of his ability to teach, and this was a personal example. The first year after I became a monk in 1980, I spent the rains retreat with Ajahn Chah, and he had 70 monks staying in the monastery, and about 50 nuns, and many lay people coming in huge numbers to see him. And one day I went on alms round, and on the way back I was walking back with another monk who was again newly ordained. And on the way back, this monk started to find fault with the other monks in the monastery. this monk wasn't doing what he liked, and this monk didn't say what he wanted, and he was complaining. And I remember thinking, I didn't want to hear complaints about other good monks. And so I walked off ahead. But I kept on thinking, he shouldn't complain about other good monks. Why is he complaining about other good monks? And I started complaining about him. And as I was thinking, he shouldn't do that, he shouldn't think that, I walked into the monastery and I had my head down thinking and carrying on this conversation that had ended 10 minutes ago. And then I heard someone say in clear English, "Good morning." And I looked up and Ajahn Chah was standing a metre away from me with a big radiant smile on his face. And it was the first time I'd ever heard him speak English. It was he could only speak 2 phrases of English. The first one was "good morning," and the other one was, "Do you want a cup of tea?" Because he went to England twice, and everyone was always asking him, "Do you want a cup of tea?" And he said it's very easy to remember because it's like in the Pali chanting when the monks give the blessing, "Upakapati." Do you want a cup of tea? And so he always remembered that. And so this was his chance to practice his English on me. He said, "Good morning." And I remember putting my hands in Anjali and smiling and responding, "Good morning, Ajahn Chah. Good morning, Lumpur." We called him Venerable Father. "Good morning, Lumpur, Venerable Father." And he smiled. And of course, my mood changed. I'd completely forgotten what this monk had said. Went back, we had the meal. That day I did sitting and walking meditation at my hut, and in the evening I decided to go and visit him because I had learned as a layman shiatsu, how to do pressure massage, and every now and then I would go to his hut and give him a foot massage, and he found that that was useful. So this day I decided, Ajahn Chah had said good morning to me, I'd go over and give him a foot massage. I went to his hut, and at that time there was about 10 or 15 monks sitting, talking on Dhamma to him and listening to him explain aspects of Dhamma. And he was sitting on a chair like this, a bamboo chair. And so I sat down in front of him on the floor, and he had his legs down, and I started massaging his feet, and he was chatting to the monks. And then they rang the bell. It was time for evening chanting, and the hall for the evening chanting was very close to his hut. And he told all the monks to leave and go off to do evening chanting. And he said, "Tanyana, you stay here." It was the first time I'd been alone with him. There were so many people usually around him. And we didn't have any candles lit, it was dark, but the moon was coming up, and it was one of those beautiful nights when temperature was just right. There was no mosquitoes around, and I was sitting with Ajahn Chah, and he just sat meditation, and I was massaging his feet, and then the monks started chanting, 70 monks, and I felt it was like in the heaven realms. There was listening monks chanting the praise of the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, and here you are repaying the debt of gratitude you owe to the teacher that the Buddha said you should do. And he was sitting there peacefully, and it was my chance to make a lot of merit. And just as I felt like my mind was in the heaven realms, he kicked me in the chest, and I fell backwards and hit my head. And then he pointed at me and said, "See?" one monk says something you don't like, and then another monk says good morning, and you're delighted all day. Do not get lost in the words of others. Watch your own mind. And then he gave me a Dhamma talk about not delighting in or getting lost in the words of others, whether it's praise or blame, whether we like it or don't. As he would say, if we like it, that's good. If we don't like it, that's good. If it's good, that's good. If it's bad, that's good. And that, I was taken back, and I sat with my hands in Anjali's. He gave a very long talk to me. But the thing that impressed me the most was that he knew me better than I knew myself. And also I was moved by his compassion, that I felt very much the compassion of, like the Buddha. We read in the suttas that in the morning the Buddha would sit meditation and use his knowledges and psychic powers to pervade the world and see, who shall I help today? Out of compassion. And then he would go and teach Angulimala, for example, and help him out of compassion, relieving him from his suffering. I felt very much that of all the monks in the monastery, Ajahn Chah had decided. He saw me walking in the monastery with my head down, thinking about what this monk said, and realized he's in hell. So he said good morning to take me up to heaven. But he realized you cannot teach somebody in heaven. You have to kick them down to the earth. And then when they're on the earth, then you can teach them not to get lost in the words of another. And he also knew that this monk is very stubborn. If he had just told me everything is impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not self, I would have forgotten that years ago. But because he kicked me, I always remember that. And I can offer that as a teaching to you. This is not just me he's kicked. Remember that yourself. When people praise you or blame you, or people say things that you agree with or disagree with, like or dislike, do not get lost in the words of others. Maintain your mindfulness and awareness of yourself. And so I'd like to give this as an example of Ajahn Chah pointing out for us to develop self-awareness and abandon our suffering. And when we do that, then we're coming back to the core teachings of the Buddha. And so today, on this special occasion, we have gathered here, and I'm so delighted to see so many people, so many good bhikkhus and good nuns and lay people who, some of you have heard of Ajahn Chah, some of you have not, are recognizing somebody who doesn't want to be recognized for himself. Ajahn Chah never wanted a personality cult around him. He always wanted us to look to the Buddha Dhamma and to look to the teachings of the Buddha as a way of liberation. To always focus on those fundamental teachings of the Buddha and to apply them and practice them in our own lives, and then we can find the freedom of suffering. So I'd like to end the talk this evening on this point.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
ทัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ So this evening I've been invited to give a Dhamma talk, and I'd like to consider it more like a reflection rather than sometimes they call it a sermon, but it's not really that, because I invite you to really observe, how what I say, how it affects you, so that you're not just thinking or being just a listener to me, but also being aware of how what I say, the sound of my voice or whatever, how it affects you emotionally. So this is a way of an attitude that I try to encourage in people, an attitude that I found most beneficial in my life, because we're so attached to the thinking mind and tend to analyze things and react to different words, tones of voice, various opinions, and then we agree or disagree with them accordingly, or we get confused, or whatever. So, in the kind of essence of Buddha's teaching is this word mindfulness. In the Pali, it's sati and sampatanya, the ability that we have as human beings to be aware of what's happening, to observe our own bodies and feelings and thoughts and reactions to the conditions we're experiencing in the present. Now this is a special day, Memorial Remembrance Day of one of the great contemporary Buddhist monks in Thailand, Ajahn Chah. And of course this was how he encouraged me when I encountered him nearly 44 years ago in Thailand. And his way of training us was to encourage us to really look and observe, our emotions, whatever they might be, positive, negative, confused, good, bad, right, wrong ones, and to be the observer or the knower, because as conscious entities, each one of us, a human individual that's conscious is a conscious entity in this vast universe that is mysterious and rather formidable, because it seems so endless and vast, and where does the universe really end? There's so many possibilities of pleasure, pain, success and failure in our lifetimes, in terms of just planetary movements, changes, natural catastrophes, then the inevitable aging process of our human bodies. The fact that we are sensitive beings, we have to live in this state of unrelenting, unmitigated sensitivity from the time we're born to the time we die. And the realm we're living in is a sense realm, so planet Earth, its environment, the bodies we have, the senses that are that register the pleasurable, painful, the beautiful, the ugly, the desirable and undesirable qualities that inevitably impinge on us as individuals in our lifetime. It's kind of an ongoing experience of irritation. So this is just to set down a kind of reflective way of looking at the human condition. It is we are strange creatures in this vast universe. Are we all alone on planet Earth, or are there other human-like creatures on other planets? This is, of course, a mystery. We're always looking for, aliens from outer space, or wondering what is beyond, and beyond our system, our universal system. And of course, the imagination can only take you so far when you have to give up, because it is endless, it's infinite. And from this position of this rather delicate and vulnerable human form that we have, we can't know that much. And so the Buddha, in his compassion, established a teaching in a way that we can learn ultimate reality, recognize, and free ourselves from delusion through observing, through witnessing, through being mindful of our condition as we're living our life within the limitations that we find ourselves as human individuals. Now, modern civilization, modern culture is based on the idea of progress and material development and evolution, and so that modern science, as it tends to be taught in most places, is based very much on empirical, of looking outward, trying to figure out everything external. Or, we've developed telescopes to look at things far away, or microscopes to look at minutiae of things we can't see with our own eyes. But it's always the tendency to look away, to go outward into the universe, into the material world that we're experiencing. And the Buddha, of course, establishing his his teaching on mindfulness. Now this word, English word, is not really all that good a word actually, but it'll do as a kind of translation of Sati Sampajanya. But its ability to reach the very center of pure consciousness before we create anything into it. If we are truly mindful and cultivate and develop mindfulness in our lives, then we're actually going to the very center, to pure conscious awareness before we become a personality or anything at all. And so this is, and of course the Buddha means, the actual word Buddha means awakened consciousness. So the historical Buddha, Gautama the Buddha, was a human individual in the universe, the same as you and I, no difference. But he, in his lifetime, was able to relinquish the cultural delusions, the conditioning of his mind, in order to recognize pure, unadulterated consciousness with awareness. And from this, of course, wisdom manifests, ability to discern and realize Dhamma, the reality of Dhamma. So this word Dhamma is a very significant word, and and to translate it, it doesn't have a really proper equivalent in English. So we take the word itself into the English context because it includes everything and no thing. It's beyond, you have the conditions and then the unconditioned. You have the sankharas and the grasping of sankharas, but there's also awareness of sankharas. Like sankharas are conditions, things that arise and cease, can be observed, whether it's mental, emotional, physical, through sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, or thought. All conditions are impermanent. So this is the way of investigating and observing the nature of all conditions, and that which is aware of conditions. That awareness takes us to what they call amatta Dhamma, awakened, conscious awakening to reality. And so this word amatta means a deathless reality, amatta Dhamma. It's a very clear and I think very brilliant formulation in language, the Buddha's teaching as we encountered in the Pali scriptures, in the suttas. I've used mainly in my monastic life just the first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Four Noble Truths. Because I found this is what I would consider a perfect teaching. It has everything in it you need to know. It's just a matter of putting it into practice, because it's not for grasping as some kind of Buddhist doctrine, but it's a tool the Buddha gave us to use to let go and free ourselves from delusions. Now, like all of us, when we're born, when a baby is born, it's a separate, it begins its life as a separate human form that's conscious. And so it has the human karma, the body that was born and that will die, and it's a conscious form. And it has the karma of the human condition. It has, instinctual intelligence, survival mechanisms, and so forth. But then as we grow up, as we develop, we're conditioned through our cultural conditioning, social conditioning, the messages, the attitudes, the language we acquire from our family, the values of our particular family, our social status, our religion, whatever it might be. And this is the conditioning process that tends to blind us to ultimate truth, to Dhamma, because the conditioning process tends to be what we cling to. As we grow up, we develop a strong sense of our separateness, our individuality, personality, identity with our human form, what we look like, gender of the body, its color of the skin, size of the nose, and all this become what we identify with, and then we compare it with other models. So we have this sense of, trying to see ourselves in comparison through comparing our appearance with somebody else's, or some ideal of physical beauty, an ideal form. We also have the ability to create ideals in our minds, of how things should be. The best, with words, with language, we can imagine the best of the conditioned realm, how everything should be. And then we tend to compare everything with the ideals that we have created. or that we have taken on from our cultural conditioning. So we have, when we grow up, then we start suffering because we're basically bound to illusions, just conditions created by unenlightened human beings, and those conditions, of course, have different qualities of good, bad, right, wrong, true and false, but whatever they are, they're never satisfying. Conditioned phenomena can never, it always leaves us in a state of dissatisfaction, disappointment, or feeling something, we're missing something is lacking in our lives. And this, the reason why we try to have wealth and security, but even at life at its very best, with all the possible wealth, security, social position, the problem is still there, because the problem itself is the blind conditioning, attachment to the conditions that human beings tend to be obstructed with, blinded by. And therefore that's why we have always conflicts, wars, problems, personal relationships, and it's ad infinitum, the variations and problems that arise on the conditioned level. For all of us, whatever culture, society, or whatever you're in, we all have our own forms of feeling dissatisfied or ill at ease or anxious about the future. We regard time as our reality. So time is what we truly believe is real, and yet time is another condition. We consider our lives in terms of the length and the age of the physical bodies we have, and its appearance, and then its conditioning, and then of course it grows up and gets old. It suffers the aging process, various illnesses, and then it dies. And so there's always this sense of pathos. Life on the human realm is always associated with a kind of sadness, because our life it always ends in death. And in the monastic life, we always, every day in a Buddhist monastery, we reflect on this reflection: all that is mine, beloved and pleasing, will become otherwise, will become separated from me. And of course this is, some people might consider this rather a depressing thing to think about, but it is the way it is. It's pointing to what every human individual has to bear with at the end of their lives, as separation, loss. And so the Buddhist meditation is a way of awakening to the real, to the ultimate reality, to Dhamma, to truth, before we die. So Lumpur Chah, one of his phrases was, "Die before you die." And so this could and of course if you try to interpret that from a mind that is not very reflective, it doesn't make much sense. But in terms of Dhamma reflection, the death is always the changing conditions. We're dying all the time, really, in various ways, and seeking rebirth through our just being blind and wanting things and not wanting things. But we don't notice it. We strongly associate ourselves with the age of our physical body. So during this time between birth and death is this possibility for enlightenment, for seeing clearly the Dhamma, or the truth, or I like to put it in English words, awake to the real. because in like in England, for example, sometimes we look like Buddhist monks. We look like to the English layman, like so you're not living in the real world. It's because we live in a monastery, and it's not the same world that most people have, to bear with in their busy lives in London and so forth. So they say you don't have to face the real world. So I thought, what is the real world then? And are they living in the real world, or what do we mean? So the real world for most people is their lives, their how much money they make, their families, their social position, paying off their debts, their mortgages, and buying a new car and so forth. The real world, or is the real world not any of that, but this awareness, awaken not to a world but to reality. And so reality then is seen in terms of discerning the difference between conditions and the unconditioned. Be able to observe and discern, which is not an analytical ability, but an intuitive sense of attentiveness, and which you're letting go of the conditioning that you've acquired in order to observe conditioning as it really is, as an impermanent, as anicca, as anatta. You begin to see that whatever you think you are, good or bad, right or wrong, that's not what you are. And so that this is to be observed, that what we are, we don't need to know what we really are, just what we are not. And so in Buddhist meditation, like especially in the insight practices of vipassana, these are skillful means in the scriptural teachings to see, to observe the way things are in order to let go of our blind attachments to birth and death, or conditioned phenomena that is in this process of change from arising, ceasing, beginning and ending. So I spent 10 years in Thailand and tried to live as close to Ajahn Chah as I could, because he'd send me off sometimes to various branch monasteries, because he was obviously a very wise human being. And right from the start, when I first met him, I was quite impressed, and even though we did have, we didn't have a common language to converse with, there's something, you can call it intuition or a sense beyond the sense, something in one kind of recognizes something that at the time maybe I didn't quite know what I was recognizing, but a kind of felt sense that this is someone to trust, someone who I would like to live near. So I spent 10 years, either in his monastery or at various branches, and then he had me sent over abroad after 10 years off to England. It's always been a kind of inspiration to see, to meet an enlightened being, or meet a wise human being in one's life. And because I remember when I was entering university, I entered university in 1951. I just turned 17 years old, very naive. And I had such admiration for all the lecturers, professors, and people that had all this learning. And so, I was, hoping to acquire some kind of wisdom and knowledge through being a university student, through these supposedly superior creatures. And of course, didn't take too long to see that wisdom was not really part of the university system that I encountered. And people might have acquired a lot of knowledge about various subjects in science, arts, history, language, and so forth, but it was an acquired knowledge, something you got from outside yourself, from reading books, from listening to others. So then my interest in meditation began when I, kind of lost interest in that kind of learning and realized that one needed to learn in a different way. And of course, the teaching of the Buddha isn't about acquiring all kinds of knowledge about Buddhism, but in actually letting go, seeing the result of attaching to knowledge that you acquire, opinions that you've acquired or created in your mind, or your own cultural conditioning, blindly assuming and operating from the very biases, prejudices, attitudes of the conditioning process, and the ego, the sense of a self as a separate entity in relationship to everything else. So in Ajahn Chah's emphasis on sati sampajanya was something I really appreciated, because he could bring the actual monastic form, the structure of Vinaya and the form into consciousness to be used, not to just institutionalize us and make us into kind of conventional monks, just like changing costumes, but to actually use conventions for observing, witnessing, reflecting on the experiences that an individual has, living within a monastery, within a disciplined structure, a committed way of surrendering to a moral convention, a system of etiquette and a tradition, and learning to use that experience not for attachment, but for helping. I could see it to help myself to see more clearly, to trust in this awareness and observe within the boundaries and structures of monastic form. And so this was, I think, Luang Por Chah's genius. It made sense out of both the Dhamma Vinaya, and he offered excellent opportunities to develop and cultivate monastic life. So it was through his wisdom and his compassion that I'm still a monk, really, because I began to appreciate, the whole package of this tradition, in the Theravada's tradition, as I learned it through living and training with Luang Por Chah in his monastery in Thailand. Wisdom is, when we use this word, one was expecting, when I was naive and a new university student, I was expecting to find wisdom in a university, and taking courses in philosophy, and we learned all kind of wise sayings and studied the wisdom of others. But, and so, we could maybe be very clever with our ways of thinking and manipulating our thoughts and intellect to come up with new ideas, new ways of analysis, or just maneuvering through the conditioned realm of thought. But the thinking process itself is an obstruction if grasped as an end in itself. And this the Buddha pointed to in his teaching of letting go of conditioned phenomena. Because, the thinking process is conditioned. Our ability to think, in the language we have, my original language is English, of course, so it's what I think in is this language. And then the thinking process depends on memory, and then it's also influenced by the